Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. Right, today we have a series of ESG webinars that we are doing, which basically on the climate change mitigation strategies. All right, and today the topic is how to objectively measure and set GHG target levels, and it will be presented by Sazalina. All right, she's from Malaysian Green Technology and Climate Change Corporation. Just a bit of recap. MGTC is an agency of the Ministry of Environment and Water, which is basically CASA. All right, and it is mandated to drive green growth, climate change mitigation, and green lifestyles. Right now, the presenter Saza, she's presented once before on GHG mitigation strategies last year. I believe it was sometime in October, right? And today she's going to give a bit more granular details on how do organizations set those target levels, right? And Saza, she's the head of GHG advisory and consultancy at the MGTC, and she currently consults states, local governments, and the private sector in monitoring and reducing GHG emissions. And she was formerly a researcher at TNB Research Sendirian Berhad, and that covers power sector emission assessments, right? And country-specific emission factors and climate change impact assessments. All right, without further ado, I just pass the time over to Saza, and go ahead, Saza.
All right. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and a very good morning, everyone. Thank you, Alex, for the introduction. But to give you an update, MGTC is basically an agency under the Ministry of Natural Resources, Environment and Climate Change. And as mentioned by Alex, this is basically the continuation of the presentation, where in the previous presentation, I have shared with you how to do the greenhouse gas emission assessment and what would be the overview of the potential mitigation measures that can be adopted by any organization to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So for today, we'll continue the presentation or sharing session with regards to how you can objectively measure your emissions and followed by setting the greenhouse gas emission targets. So for the interest for those who not participate in the previous session, we'll do some recap with regards to the greenhouse gas emission introduction. What is the type of greenhouse gas emissions and the source of greenhouse gas emission itself, and some basic how to do greenhouse gas emission assessment, followed by how to conduct the greenhouse gas mitigation and how you can set the greenhouse gas emission target objectively. So basically, this is typical situation where people always confuse between greenhouse gases and pollutants. Greenhouse gases mainly a gas that trap heat in our atmosphere, while pollutants such as carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, SOx or NOx is basically the gases or pollutant that emitted that will cause you adverse impact to the human health. But basically, the greenhouse gas is the main culprit or the main gases that give impact to the global warming and climate change. So basically, there are four main greenhouse gases type, which is start with carbon dioxide, which mainly produce from the combustion activity, from transportation, from power industry, from oil and gas, and also from building and industry sector. While methane is basically emitted from solid waste disposal, from the landfill, from the rice cultivation, fugitive emission from oil and gas, and industrial wastewater. Kindly note that methane and the harmful or the of methane gases is basically 28 times more than carbon dioxide. Okay, while for the nitrous oxide, the source is mainly from agricultural soil management, where you apply fertilizer. So fertilizer that contain nitrate will also one of the main source for nitrous oxide emission. Manure management and industry or chemical production also produce a nitrous oxide, where nitrous oxide is 260 more harmful compared to carbon dioxide. Okay, then followed by fluorinated gases such as hydrofluorocarbon, which mainly used in our air conditioning system or refrigerator system, where it is actually to substitute ozone depleting substance such as CFC. But because of this, it causes the greenhouse gas emissions. And HFC is 1,300 more harmful compared to CO2. Beside HFC, we have also fluorocarbon, uh, which mainly emitted from electric and electronic industries, such as those industries that produce flat screen TV or solar PV panel. And while SFC is sulfur hexafluoride, is gases that used in the electrical equipment as an insulator. And for the greenhouse gas emission assessment, it involves three main steps, which is you start with identify which activity release the greenhouse gas emissions. And then categorize the emission into scope of greenhouse gas emission, where it divided into three scopes that I will explain in detail later, where we have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Followed by, we will do the calculation emission from activities that relevant to your company, and we will categorize the emission according the respective scopes of emission. So this is basically how the greenhouse gas emission is categorized according to greenhouse gas protocol, where we do have a scope 1, which is it is a direct emission sources owned or controlled by any organization. For example, your company fleet that use petrol and diesel. And sometimes there is a certain organization that use diesel for genset, maybe genset for as a backup or as an alternative electricity for grid. In terms of scope 2, it is basically in the indirect emission sources from consumed energy. So any consumed energy can be based on your purchase electricity from the grid or your purchase district cooling. While for scope 3, it is basically other indirect emission sources that lie along your value chain, and therefore also it is within your responsibility. Example of the scope 3 emission would be your business travel, your employee commuting, your purchase goods and services. For example, your purchase of stationery or your purchase of service from any consultant. So there is emission based on that activity, then it will be included under scope 3. Okay, with regards to the greenhouse gas emission category, what I have mentioned earlier is basically the category of emission for organization. But on top of that, the category can be in terms of the personal basis or emission for any product that we measure based on the entire life of the product or goods or services. Or as mentioned, emission category for organization. And we also have the emission quantification or accounting for cities, where within MGTC itself, we do have a specific team that look into emission release of based on city boundary. And with regards to our country, Malaysia also do account Malaysia greenhouse gas emissions or national greenhouse gas inventory, and this exercise has been conducted frequently, and a report has been produced for this purpose and submitted to United Framework on Climate Change. Okay, now I briefly explain to you or share with you how you can quantify and the scope of greenhouse gas emissions. And after that, definitely we have to manage the greenhouse gas emission that released within our organization. And we also need to reduce the emission across to our supply chain. So it starts with measurement, where we will do the greenhouse gas accounting, where typically any organization will set the emission boundary. The emission boundary is in terms of your organizational boundary and your operational boundary. Then you calculate the emission according to scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, followed by emission reduction, where you adopt or implement mitigation initiative or mitigation actions. Identify the mitigation strategy that relevant to reduce emissions. You can apply a bottom-up approach in order for you to identify the reliable or something that effective to be implemented as mitigation initiative. Then followed by analyze and prioritize area with high emissions, which I will explain in detail in my subsequent slide. Identify abatement measures which contribute to emission reduction according to its economic performance and time frame. And you need to reduce as much as you can and offset your residual emissions. So means that the remaining emission can be offset, and a variety of offset methods, for example, nature-based solution, forest conservation. I mean, you maintain any area of forest, and in order the forests keep on function as a carbon sink. And you can also conduct a tree planting program. And offset can be done through a renewable energy project as well. Okay, then in detail, for the greenhouse gas emission assessment for the first part, which basically you will need activity data, means that any activity that create GHG emissions, and the activity data need to be quantifiable measurement of that activity. For example, how much kilowatt hour used by your building or by your office, or total of total of petrol consumed by your company vehicle. Then from that activity data, how you convert into emission is by applying the specific emission factor or conversion factor. So for example, like for electricity consumption, we will apply respective emission factor for electricity. And based on that, we will also calculate according to specific greenhouse gas emissions, which I have mentioned earlier. So certain activity will release only CO2, but certain activities will also release other gases. So we will need to apply a global warming potential which is it is an equivalency for greenhouse gas emissions. And in total, the result of your total greenhouse gas emission will be in carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, this is basically the guideline and methodology that typically applied by any organization to do the greenhouse gas emission accounting. In terms of the guideline, it will be based on the greenhouse gas protocol, which they do produce guideline, a specific guideline for scope 1 and scope 2, and how you can account and report the greenhouse gas emission for scope 3 or your value chain emissions. In terms of methodology that I have mentioned earlier, there is a specific methodology according to the activity where 2006 IPCC guideline do have a specific calculation method. And in the same time, on top of that, you can also refer to other recognized standard of methodology, such as US EPA GHG inventory guidance. And for certain industry, they do have a specific guidelines to do the calculation. For example, the one that I have put here is basically a specific methodology for cement manufacturing. Okay, we now know how to quantify the greenhouse gas emission. Now it's come to how to manage and how to set target with regards to the greenhouse gas emission. And we always heard about emission target using net zero concept. So basically, net zero refer to the balance between the greenhouse gas emission produced versus how much you reduce from the atmosphere. And basically, the concept of the net zero is basically is tied with how much your GHG emission level based on the measurement that you have conducted, and followed by setting the base year. So after you have measured your GHG emission, you will need to determine what will be your base year. So there is no specific guideline how to determine base year, but basically you can choose any years that you have greenhouse gas emissions data that are reliable, representative, and verifiable. And from that, you will do the projection um, for future emission of your organization, and you will apply the mitigation strategies in order for you to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And basically, definitely, it is impossible for any organization to achieve 100% net zero within your own organization. Common, you will have residual. So for the residual emission, you still need to remove by using offset or GHG removal approach. And that is a standard, a gold standard with regards to the net zero target, which is called Science-Based Target Initiative, where according to the SBTI, Science-Based Target Initiative, you need to reduce up to 90% and you can offset the 10% of your residual. Okay, so now we come to a specific approach or methodology that you can undertake with regards to the target setting. Based on the emission level that you have quantified, you will need to identify what would be your key drivers that influence future emissions. For example, like manufacturing company, your influence might be in terms of your production. For a power utility company, your influence might be the demand of electricity itself will influence your future emissions. For example, like if there is increase of demand in future from consumer for the electricity, you will need to generate more. So that will be the driver of future emissions. and you will need to estimate what will be your future emission. And typically, the organization will do a mid and long-term emission projection. Then set base year, as I mentioned earlier, you can set base year, you can set any year as your base or as your baseline according to the completeness, the reliability and verifiable data that you have. And you can set a different target for or different base year for scope 1 and scope 2, and you can have another base year for scope 3. And from the emission sources, you will need to analyze your emission hotspot and identify mitigation strategies. This is important why you need to identify the hotspot. It means that what will be the larger contributor of your total emissions. This is because you can propose mitigation measures strategically because there is if you tackle the largest contributor, definitely you will achieve your emission reduction target. And according to IPCC methodology, it will be good if you tackle the 95% of your emission hotspot. And set year to achieve net zero target, it can be either set interim or long-term target. For certain company, they will have two series of target. For example, like they can have interim target in the year 2030 or 2035, and long-term target would be in terms of 2050. And in terms of the follow-up action after you have set your emission target, it will be good if you can develop action plan and target. So for each strategy that you have identified. So for example, like you have identified installation of solar PV in your building. So that installation can be by phases, and you can put any timeline or target. So in order for you to achieve your interim and your long-term targets. And typically what we usually propose to our client is for you to do engagement session where you will share your findings, and based on that you will validate your input, so that basically is not something one main show approach. Means that you will get a collective participation from all level within your organization. And from that, definitely we also encourage or propose to our client to come up with a detailed action plan, which consists of a specific timeline, KPI or program to support the target that has been set. Okay. Okay. This is basically a specific step in order for you to set a target. And commonly, what drive any good organization to set the target is basically to minimize and managing the greenhouse gas risk, be it based on the climate change impact to the to organization, or maybe because of there is other risks that related to climate change. For example, introduction of new policy or new regulation that related to greenhouse gas and climate change. And to achieve cost saving and stimulate innovation, we encounter a situation where the main goal for that company do that initiative is basically for cost saving, but then indirectly it actually contribute to the emission reduction. Point number 3 is basically something that related to point number 1, preparing for future regulation, where this is also a preparedness for any organization for future regulation, although Malaysia yet to have any regulation or any incentive with regards to the greenhouse gas emission management. Also, it demonstrates leadership and corporate responsibility. All that is why many organizations has start quantify the greenhouse gas emission and set their own target. And you can also participate in any voluntary programs. It can be any program which basically for your corporate disclosure, or maybe to meet your investor requirement. So basically, there are 10 steps how to set the greenhouse gas emission target, where I will explain to you in detail. So before that, let me pause for a while. And Alex, is there any question in the chat box, or I can continue?
Yeah. Are there any questions from the floor? I mean, there's a lot of granular details here. Yeah, and we can perhaps circle back later, but any questions from the floor? I'm just wondering, in all this setting of the targets, Saza, how long does it take, let's say an organization, right, to set up such a system like this?
Okay. Alex, it depends on from one organization to another. If the organization has start measure their greenhouse gas emission, the target setting will typically about 3 to 4 months. But if you have not started any greenhouse gas measurement, so you don't know what is your greenhouse gas emission level, so you need to start with the greenhouse gas emission accounting. So total from greenhouse gas emission accounting up to greenhouse gas emission target setting, if include a detailed roadmap, will typically can go up to 6 months. Because, okay, this is basically our approach. Yeah, Alex, because we always adopt a bottom-up approach where we go in detail at the lower level, what will be the potential and doable initiative by your organization. Any organization can put, okay, I want to reduce by 30% by the year 2025. But if that target is not something achievable, so it will be difficult to implement. So that is the reason why we always go by bottom-up approach. So from every at the working level, we identify what would be the achievable, reliable, not reliable, the feasible project that can be implemented technically. Then from that, we translate how much emission reduction, and we translate how much the percentage of the target.
Okay, so Saza, when MGTC provides consultancy to organizations like even for MBank, typically how would you charge us or charge the clients based on how does that even come into the equation?
Okay, that also relate to previous question. How long and how much is also depends on the scale of your organization itself. For example, if you have a subsidiary or you have a joint venture, so it also impact the timeline and the cost of doing the consultancy. And currently, I prefer to put a range. Is range from 200 and to 300,000 complete with greenhouse gas emission and the target roadmap.
I see. Okay, that's wonderful. At least you have some idea of the quantum involved here. Yeah. Any other questions from the floor? Otherwise, I think let's continue. Maybe
Let's
we'll
continue.
pick up
Okay.
there. Yeah.
All right. Okay, first, in order for you to set a target, you will need to obtain, okay, after you have identified the potential mitigation initiative and you have translate it into how much emission reduction, and based on that, you will versus with your baseline. From that, you will have a proposed number for your midterm and long term. And after that, you will need to obtain a senior management commitment. This is because the buy-in and commitment is important for any successful GHG reduction program. Because after you have set any target, you will not stop there. There will be a continuation where you need to continue to monitor the greenhouse gas reduction. So the success or the impact of the greenhouse gas emission reduction itself. And then you will need to implement a reduction target based on the agreed number, and which will likely necessitate the change in behavior and decision making throughout the organization. For example, like, okay, in order for you to achieve 30% emission reduction in the year 2030 compared to 2019, you have to adopt purchasing of green products for your organization. So that is why I mentioned it is important for you to get involved the senior management commitment. And it is also required to establish internal accountability and incentive system and provide adequate resources to achieve the target. For example, in order for you to reduce emission from employee committing, maybe you will encourage for staff to adopt energy efficient vehicle or electric vehicle. But in order to support that, you will provide incentive. So that is one of example that you can apply. Sorry. And you decide the target type for organization. There are two broad types of GHG target. You can be absolute target, usually expressed in reduction over time, is specific quantified GHG emission to the atmosphere, and the unit typically being tons of CO2 equivalent. As I mentioned earlier, after you have identified the mitigation initiative and you translate into emission reduction, that will become your absolute target. But there is also other approach undertaken by another organization where they have set the target according to intensity base, which usually expressed as a reduction in the ratio of GHG emission relative to another business metric. For example, ton CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour, which is this basically adopted by TMB, where they target to reduce 35% by the year 2025, which is basically the 35% is derived based on their ton CO2 per megawatt hour. And from that, you can decide on the target boundary. You can choose a minimum one of 7 greenhouse gas covered by UNFCCC, the gases that I have mentioned earlier. You minimum you need to choose CO2, but it also depends to their nature of business, because certain organization, they emit more or emit more of other gases compared to CO2. So that is why you have heard that there is a company set a target based on they become net zero greenhouse gas by the year 2050. And certain company, they set a target of net zero carbon by the year 2050. The difference is if they set net zero carbon, means that the company will reduce only CO2. And maybe for greenhouse gas, other greenhouse gas is insignificant. While for other organization that set a target based on gas, means that they include all the gases that related to the company. And you can also set the boundary based on geographical operation. This is example applied by Petronas, where their target is based on Malaysia operation, and where they do limits the target based on geographical scope. Right, Alex?
Hi, hello. Yeah,
Ah,
sorry, Sally, I think my line kind of was cut off. I'm sorry.
ah, ah, ah.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. That just now we stopped at the geographical operation, right?
Yes, correct, correct.
All right, okay. Okay, now as mentioned earlier, you can have different set of target for your emission sources. You can have a specific target for your scope one, or you can have a combined emission target for scope one and scope two, or you can have a combined emission target for scope one, scope two, and scope three, ataupun you can have a respective emission boundary or target boundary for scope one, scope two, and scope three. And you can also have different types of businesses where the boundary can be set according to diverse operation, different core business with different, you can have a different target. For example, there is a oil and gas company that set target, a specific target for their upstream business, and they will have a specific target for their downstream business. Okay, then followed by choose the target base year. As mentioned previously, the base year can be set based on the most completeness, the most completed or verifiable or reliable data that you would have, and you can set the base year based on fixed target base year, um, where it is a fixed reference year in the past. For example, like we will emit 30% less in the year 2030 compared to the year 2005. And you could also have a rolling target base year, which is you compare your emission performance based compared to the previous year. For example, like over the next 10 years, we will reduce emission every year by 2% compared to the previous year. um, you will need to define a target completion date. The target completion date determine whether the target is relative short or long term. That's what I mentioned. You can have a mid-term target and long-term target as well. And the long-term target with a completion year more than 10 years from the time the target has been set, it will facilitate long-term planning for large capital investment with the greenhouse gas benefits. And you can follow it by define length of the target commitment period. The target commitment period is the period of time during which emission performance is actually measured against the target. It will ends with the target completion date, and many companies use a single year commitment periods, and the length of the target commitment period is an important factor in determining a company level of commitment. And in step number 7, you can decide on the use of offset ataupun credit. As mentioned earlier, you can offset or use carbon credit for your residual emission. And a GHG target can be met entirely from internal reduction, at source. If according to SBTI, you need to reduce first internally, and you can include additional using offset that generated from GHG reduction project that reduce emission at source, or enhancing, which is for enhancing is typically for the forest project external to the target boundary. And the use of offset may be appropriate when the cost of internal reduction is high, and or your emission reduction initiative is already being covered, or saturated. Opportunities for reduced emission is limited, or the company itself unable to meet the target because of unexpected circumstances. For example, that you have to sustain, and you still need to emit uh, the greenhouse gas emissions. Common types of carbon offset program, it can be forestry and conservation through, as mentioned earlier, you can have adopting a forest area, and prevent and maintain the forest area. And you can also adopt renewable energy projects or community projects and waste to energy project. And establish a target double counting policy, which is this step to address double counting of GHG reduction and offset, as well as allowance issued by external trading programs. It applies only to the company that engage in trading or sale or purchase of GHG offset, or whose or whichever corporate target boundary interferes with other companies' target or external program. Which this is to double counting of your offset, double counting due to the target overlap, or double counting of allowance traded in external program. Which this mainly happen to any organization that located in European country, where they do have emission cap and trade system. So where the organization has given allowance in terms of their emissions, and has been put any cap. So if there is a certain organization that emit below the allowance or below the cap, they can trade the allowance to another organization. And under step 9, you will need to decide on your target level, which is to understand the key drivers affecting GHG emissions by examining the relationship between GHG emission and other business metric. Develop different reduction strategies based on the major reduction opportunities that available, and examine effects on the total GHG emissions. Investigate how emission projection change with different mitigation strategies. So it is actually also a common, if there is any organization that will revise their emission target, this is because of there is a change in their business operation as well. Factoring relevant growth factor, relevant growth such as production plans, revenue or sales target, or a return on investment of other criteria that will drive investment strategically. And next slide, which track and report progress, which basically will be my last presentation, last slide, where you, after you have set the emission target, you will need to track and report your progress. Either it can be through your sensitivity report or any disclosure platform, and it is important or necessary to track performance against it to check the compliance and maintain your credibility. Otherwise, it will become one of your reputational risk as well. So that is why it is important for you to report emissions, and any external reduction is consistent, completeness, and transparent. And you, last point, which is basically my key message to everyone. You will also need to carry out regular performance checks. Maybe you can achieve your target ahead of what you have set, and you can have a revision towards your target. Or because of certain circumstances, you will not be able to achieve the target that has been set. So it is important for you to have a performance checks and do a revision towards your emission target. And it will be a good practice for the organization to report information related to the target in terms of description of the target and information of emissions, current emissions, and performance that related to the target. Performance can be in terms of your GHG emission performance, as well as the mitigation performance. With that, I end my presentation. I open for any question that you would like to raise, or maybe input that you would like to share with me.
Many thanks, Saza. That was a really detailed presentation. And in fact, yeah, I just want to open up the floor again. Any questions, anyone, from this whole this webinar? Please feel free.
Yeah, Saza, hi.
Yeah.
Good morning. This is Helen here. I'm from the fund management side. Just want to check, right? Because normally I'm just trying to reconcile this to the Paris Accord, right? So Paris Accord wanted to limit the temperature increase to below 2 degrees, right? By end of the century, right? And as a result, all the countries they kind of promised to limit their emissions, and to achieve that targeted reduction in temperature increase, right? Now, but based on what you said, it seems like each organization, it's up to them to set their emissions target. It doesn't really align to a certain temperature pathway, if you know what I'm saying. So if everyone sets, let's say mBank sets it at 30% reduction, and maybe, I don't know, RHB sets it at 10% reduction, and then at the end of, let's say, 2050, all these targeted emissions reductions still end up with a temperature increase of, I don't know, 3 degrees. I mean, how is it reconciled in the end at the national level? I mean, it cannot be that we are setting our own targets, right? There's got to be some kind of national reconciliation, right? So that we limit the temperature increase, right?
Okay, Helen, thank you very much for your question. Maybe I'm not making it clear when I mention a long-term target. A long-term target means that be it national level or organizational level, in order to meet a Paris Agreement target, we will need to be a net zero. So for national, we will need to be a net zero nation, and for organization, you need to be a net zero organization by the year 2050. Otherwise, we will not be able to limit the emission increase by 2 degrees Celsius by the year 2050. And with regards to any organization will set their target is actually referring to your mid-term target. For mBank, if you think that by the year 2030, you can achieve 30%, then you can achieve 100% reduction by the year 2050. Yes, you can do it. Means that if you achieve 30% by the 2030, from 2030 onwards, you need to reduce or to mitigate your remaining emission and become net zero. So if you think that 30% is not aggressive enough, you can set more. Or you can you foresee based on your projection. If I set 30% by the year 2030 or by the year 2040 or 2035, I can do another mitigation and reduction, and to which towards the end I can still achieve 2050. So means that 2050 net zero will be your end target. And typically the how any country or organization set their mid and long-term target is based on their circumstances. So definitely everyone has contributions towards the same goal, which is net zero by the year 2050 to support the Paris Agreement. Hope that
Okay, yeah,
clear.
that's very clear, Sazalina.
All right.
Just want to check, the net zero applies to scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions? Or just because a lot of the organizations that I've talked to, right, because in fund management we meet a lot of companies, most of them just report scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, not even scope 3, because it's very hard to measure.
I understand.
Yeah, so is the net zero target, is it up to scope 3 for Malaysia?
If you it's not only for Malaysia, it's actually a global practice. If you participate in SBTI, Science Based Target Initiative, which is I mentioned, it is a gold standard with regards to the target setting. According to SBTI, your target setting must include scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. But you can set emission target for your scope 1, scope 2 first. Then after that, you can do emissions setting for your scope 3. It's not necessarily for you to have the target setting for all scopes that you have. It can be by stages, and it can be by phase as well.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
So I think like 7, right? So there's 4 types of carbon offset programs. I understand that 1, 2, and 4 are means of for instance, one is
sorry, your voice is
so
very
is
soft. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's
Can you
very
hear me now?
soft. Yeah, better.
Okay. So I understand that 1, 2, and 4, you could reduce your emissions and you could reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. But how do we assess the amount of carbon we're offsetting for community projects? And what are the samples of community projects that we could do?
Okay, the community project is not a typical project that will happen in Malaysia. The example is it happened in India, for example, where the community typically will log forest as a the source of fuel. Then there is a program that they provide alternative source of energy to the community, and we do also have example in Sabah or rural area where they use a diesel for genset, where they not connected to the grid, so they use diesel for genset. So there is a program that they provide solar hybrid project, where the genset itself is combined with solar. So they will use a certain portion of electricity from solar generation and certain portion from diesel. Although there is a fossil fuel consumption, but it still contribute to reduction. So that is example of community project. Is it clear, Encik Sai?
All right, got it. Thank
All right.
you.
All right.
Any other questions? Yeah, I'm just wondering, Saza, the steps that you've provided for all of us, in terms of setting the the carbon, emissions. Are these universally practiced by other ESG consultants? I mean, there are many consultants now. Are these procedures and steps, is this something that, I don't know, is it best practice or is it standard? Because everyone, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I cannot claim that that is a best practice. Typically, when we doing the consultancy service, we always rely on the guideline that recognized or established internationally. So those 10 steps that I've mentioned is basically from GHG protocol. They do have a specific guideline on how to set emission reduction target. So that information is basically based on GHG protocol standard, and it actually depends and maybe varies from one consultant to another actually, and you don't necessarily to follow all the 10 steps that I have mentioned.
I see. Because nowadays, every company, I would think like on a which is listed, will want to say that they're ESG compliant. How do we make sure that whatever it is that they're declaring is actually the steps that they're doing? Is there an audit or is there a verification process involved? Who would do the verification process? I mean, let's say it's just a statement, or a page write-up that you do in the annual report. How do you even know that that is even what they're doing?
All right. Okay. There is a certain company that can simply claim or do what they have claim or mention about their target. But those good governance company, they will incorporate elements of verification as what you mentioned. The verification is not necessarily to verify all the elements under your E, S, or G. The typical practice that being adopted by company, they always verify their greenhouse gas emission level, and there is a company that can do a third-party verification in terms of their greenhouse gas emission level, and they can also verify their emission reduction target. And if your company commit to SBTI, SBTI itself will have a dedicated team to do the verification. So it cannot be a simply self-claim. You have to portray and be transparent with regards to your greenhouse gas emission and the target, how you derive the target itself. And with regards to who can do the verification for the greenhouse gas emission, there is several organizations that certified with ISO 14064. For example, like we have CIRIM, SGS, BSI. We also have PwC. There is many others organization can do third-party verification. So to reduce the risk of your disclosure, you need to identify the credible third-party verifier.
That's very interesting. I'm just wondering, for someone to do a verification, I'm sure the charges will be different from what you would be setting for under MGTC. Well, how much would they? I mean, I don't know whether the process even started on the verification or not. But how much is such? I mean, are those consultancy fees for just to verify on those?
I'm not sure in terms of their average, but basically, it would also depends on the magnitude. As mentioned, it also depends the number of entities that will be included in the verification. Entities under your organization, and for example, number of plants that you have, number of divisions or subsidiary or your JV that you will include in the verification, and scope of the emission category also will also influence the cost of the verification. For example, if there is a difference if you include scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 in the same time. If you go by stages, you verify for scope 1 and scope 2 only.
Okay, all right. That's wonderful. That's very clear, Saza. Thanks so much. And I think we've come to the end of our time. It's at 11:30. But any last questions from the floor? All right. Otherwise,
maybe Alex, the participant would not have any question right now, but you have my email, so that feel free to email with us.
Yes.
To email any queries to us.
Sure. Okay. Or alternatively, you have any questions, you can just email to me and I'll forward over to Saza.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Anyway, thanks so much, Saza. It's been really, really informative, and there are things that we learn, and to also have a bit of appreciation of the detail and the process that's involved. Yeah, it's not just a simple thing that we just put a table and just fill out the blanks. Yeah. So
No.
thanks very much, Saza. And okay, we also next week, well, for MBank, we are also having another webinar. It's one on social protection policies in Malaysia. All right, and yeah, I think the emails would have been sent out to you, to our participants here as well. All right. So anyway, again, we want to thank Saza again, and we'll see what other areas of insights that she can give in on her expertise in future. Yeah.
Inshallah. All right.
Thank you.
Hope everyone
Bye.
benefited with what I'm shared. And my apologies if it is too technical. I try my best to simplify for you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thanks.